Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Over 100 years ago, H.L. Mencken said, "A newspaper is a device for making the ignorant more ignorant and the crazy crazier." And every day the BBC demonstrates what Mencken was saying. Portland, Oregon and Seattle, Washington experienced all-time record heat the last few days. BBC environment analyst Roger Harabin weighed in. He said, "We can't say for certain this brutal heat storm has been caused by emissions from industrial society, but it's exactly the sort of extreme scientists have warned of as CO2 levels continue to rise." In fact, scientists have got much better at linking some extreme events to climate change, such as the heat wave that scorched Europe in 2019, which researchers say was made 100 times more likely due to CO2. Yet China and India continue to build new coal-fired power stations, and the G7 won't give a date to phase them out. The UK and others are still drilling for more oil and gas to burn, saying it'll be needed to 2050. It's certainly looking like a climate emergency. And in the article, the BBC showed a photograph of people sleeping at a cooling center set up in Portland. So what exactly is a cooling center? This is a large building with air conditioning, probably powered by fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are quite literally keeping these people alive, yet the BBC is demonizing fossil fuels in the article. There's almost no wind in Seattle today, which is typical of these sort of heat waves. If these people had to rely on wind power to stay alive, they wouldn't do very well. Climate alarmists have made it very clear that they want to ban air conditioning. They say that air conditioning is overheating the planet and people would stay much cooler without it. The BBC says that the climate would be much cooler without air conditioning, and they also say that air conditioning is keeping people from burning up in the heat. In the past, people didn't have the luxury of this sort of mental idiocy. During the heat waves of 1936, thousands of people in the United States died in the heat. Unlike BBC writers who are sitting in their nice fossil fuel-powered climate-controlled offices, many people in 1936 didn't have access to air conditioning and lots of them died. During the heat wave around July 4, 1911, thousands of people in New England died in the heat. In fact, large numbers of people committed suicide as a way to escape the heat. They probably would have been better off with fossil fuel-powered air conditioning. July 4, 1911 was the hottest Independence Day in U.S. history. There were 100-degree temperatures from coast to coast. And the heat was on both sides of the Atlantic during the summer of 1911. 40,000 people died in Paris during a 70-day-long heat wave, and most of the dead were babies. I would imagine that the parents of those babies would have been very happy to have air conditioning around to keep their child alive. Now let's go back 120 years to June 29, 1901. New York Times, "Heat brings death and much suffering. Life rendered almost unbearable in the tenement districts." June 30, 1901, New York wilts in protracted heat. Temperature on the street from 98 to 106 in the shade. Many dead and prostrated. July 1, 1901, the city a furnace, virtually deserted. July 2, 1901, heat's holocaust in the 5 boroughs. 87 deaths and 178 prostrations mark hottest July 1st on record. July 3, 1901, heat brings death to over 200 persons. Several hundred others collapse in stifling atmosphere. July 4, 1901, 200 more dead before rain falls. And the 1901 heat wave was also in Europe. New York Times, July 19, 1901. The heat wave in Europe. Numerous deaths in London. Effects of drought serious. New York Times, August 11, 1901. Unprecedented heat in Italy. Vineyards shriveled up. People forced to sleep in the open air. The thermometer in many parts of the country registers 43 centigrade, 109 Fahrenheit in the shade. The vineyards in entire districts have been shriveled up by the scirocco and ruined to the very roots, as though set on fire. Wow, it sounds like there was a terrible climate emergency on both sides of the Atlantic in 1901. And another climate emergency 5 years earlier in 1896. During the summer of 1896, a 10-day heat wave killed nearly 1,500 people in New York City. Many of the dead were tenement dwellers. That doesn't sound like low CO2 climate justice to me. And earlier in 1896, Southeast Australia had their worst heat wave on record. New York Times, August 18, 1896. Hottest of hot waves on record. How it struck sweltering New South Wales in January last. Talking about hot weather, one day last January, the mercury at Adelaide, Australia marked 127 degrees in the shade. The author wrote, I've seen hot days in our own country, in Illinois, Iowa, Ohio, Kansas, and 20 other states, and much suffering from excessive heat. But when compared to Australia, those memories fade into harmless imaginings. It was 121 degrees at Burke, New South Wales. In many locations, they reported 125 degrees. High records, numerous deaths, and blasted crops in Australia. And the 1896 heat wasn't just confined to the United States and Australia, it also hit Europe. Great heat in Europe, numerous cases of sunstroke, birds dropped dead in Spain. During May of 1896, St. Louis was largely destroyed by a tornado, with many people dead. And National Geographic reported in 1896 that Alaska's largest glacier had retreated 40 miles at Glacier Bay. They had a really bad climate emergency 125 years ago in 1896. The New York Times reported in 1935 127-degree heat in Spain. That sounds like a climate emergency. And in 1906, Mildura, Victoria reported 124 degrees in the shade. On June 17, 1859, Santa Barbara, California recorded a world's record temperature of 133 degrees. That was definitely a climate emergency. In 1718, Europe didn't have any rain from April to October. The crops were burnt up and the rivers were dried up. In 1818, the theaters in Europe remained closed for nearly a month due to the heat. 200 years ago in 1821, a plague of mice came with intolerable heat. More than 200,000 people died from the heat in France. On the 6th of February 1851, 170 years ago, most of the state of Victoria burned up in a few hours. Melbourne reported a temperature of 117 degrees in the shade at 8 o'clock in the morning. And the hottest official temperature ever recorded was at Greenland Ranch, California on July 10, 1913. They reached 134 degrees in the shade and were over 130 degrees 3 times that week. There's been a lot of climate emergencies in the past when carbon dioxide levels were very low. Now let's look at some actual science. Most of the U.S. was very cool today, but there was record heat in the Pacific Northwest and was also quite hot in New England. Temperatures were very cool in New Mexico, with a lot of the state being 20 degrees below normal. For the world as a whole, the temperature was 0.2 degrees Celsius above the 1979 to 2000 average. Much of Antarctica was extremely cold, but Roger Harriban at the BBC determined that this red region right here was a climate emergency which was caused by carbon dioxide. Across the United States, the vast majority of all-time temperature records were set before 1960, with about 1/4 of them occurring just in the year 1936. About 90% of the all-time U.S. temperature records were set with carbon dioxide levels below 350 parts per million. Almost every year we'll get a few stations which experience all-time record heat, like Seattle and Portland. But it's not an indication of a climate emergency, it's just natural weather variability. The last national climate assessment showed that summers used to be much hotter in the United States, particularly before 60 years ago. The average maximum temperature in the United States has declined sharply over the past century, even as carbon dioxide levels have increased. And the same story with the percent of hot days in the United States. They've declined sharply over the last 100 years. The actual data shows that there's no correlation between heat waves and carbon dioxide. In fact, it shows the opposite. The BBC story has nothing to do with science and nothing to do with reality. Let's read the first paragraph again. We can't say for certain this brutal heat storm has been caused by emissions from industrial society, but it's exactly the sort of extreme scientists have warned of as CO2 levels continue to rise. But we've always had extreme weather. Predicting that extreme weather is going to happen is like predicting that the sun will rise in the morning. Now let's read the second paragraph. In fact, scientists have got much better at linking some extreme events to climate change, such as the heatwave that scorched Europe in 2019. But Europe's always had heat waves. In 1911, 40,000 people died in the heat in Paris. And 200 years ago in 1821, 200,000 people died from the heat in France. The only thing these scientists have gotten much better at is making baseless speculations to the press. And their goal is to demonize the fossil fuels and air conditioning, which keep people from dying in huge numbers like they did in 1911 and 1821. What these journalists and academics are doing has nothing to do with science, it has nothing to do with reality, and everything to do with political power. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on these frauds for the past 13 years. You can visit him, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.